A century of conflict, 5 shocking facts. Today we're diving into one of the most complex and long-standing conflicts in modern history, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. It's a story of two peoples with overlapping claims to the same land, a history marred by wars, terrorism and failed peace attempts. And if you're thinking, oh boy, here we go, another depressing news segment, well, you're not wrong, but this isn't just about understanding a conflict on the other side of the world. This is about grappling with issues of colonialism, displacement, and the human cost of seemingly intractable political standoffs. We're talking decades of violence, generations raised in the shadow of conflict, and a situation where even the most basic aspects of daily life, things we often take for granted, can become flashpoints. So buckle up, because we're about to unpack 5 shocking facts about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Facts that might just make you see this seemingly intractable situation in a whole new light. Laying the groundwork, a history marred by displacement. To truly understand this conflict, we need to rewind a bit, travel back in time to the early 20th century. Back then, the region we know today as Israel and the Palestinian territories were part of the Ottoman Empire. It was a melting pot of cultures and religions, with a significant Jewish population already residing there. Then World War I happened. The Ottoman Empire found itself on the losing side, and the map of the Middle East was redrawn by the victors. This is where the plot thickens. Enter the British, stage left, with a promise to establish a national home for the Jewish people in Palestine. This declaration, known as the Balfour Declaration, would have monumental consequences, essentially setting the stage for the conflict we see today. Now, this promise was made without really consulting the people who already lived there, the Palestinians. You can imagine how well that went down. The stage was set for tension, resentment, and ultimately conflict over land. As more Jews, many fleeing persecution in Europe, immigrated to Palestine throughout the early 20th century, tensions with the Arab population escalated. It was a recipe for disaster, a pressure cooker of competing claims and escalating violence. The British, stuck in the middle of this increasingly volatile situation, essentially threw their hands up in the air and said, "Good luck figuring this one out," and handed the problem over to the newly formed United Nations. And if you think the UN, with its reputation for, let's say, lengthy deliberations, was the answer, well, I have some swampland in Florida to sell you. The UN proposed a partition plan, a 2-state solution, but this was rejected by the Arab leadership at the time. So with no resolution in sight and tensions reaching a boiling point, we arrive at a pivotal moment in history. 1948, the year Israel declared independence. 1948 marked a turning point in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, but it wasn't a peaceful one. As soon as Israel declared independence, neighboring Arab states launched an attack, kicking off the first Arab-Israeli war. Imagine this: a newly established nation surrounded by hostile neighbors, fighting for its very survival. That was Israel in 1948, and fight they did. Against the odds, Israel emerged victorious, solidifying its existence, but also displacing hundreds of thousands of Palestinians. This mass exodus, known as the Nakba, or catastrophe in Arabic, is a deeply traumatic event in Palestinian history. Imagine being forced from your home, losing your land, becoming a refugee in a moment's notice. It's a wound that continues to shape Palestinian identity and fuel the conflict to this day. The war's end didn't bring peace, just a fragile armistice. Israel controlled more territory than initially allocated under the UN partition plan, while Jordan and Egypt held the remaining parts of what was supposed to be a Palestinian state. The Gaza Strip, a tiny coastal enclave, became a haven for many displaced Palestinians, falling under Egyptian control. Meanwhile, the West Bank, home to the city of Jerusalem, came under Jordanian rule. The 1948 war had lasting consequences, redrawing the map of the Middle East and leaving the question of a Palestinian state unanswered. It also sowed the seeds for future conflicts, as the issues of Palestinian refugees and the status of Jerusalem remained unresolved. It was a conflict that, far from ending, merely paused for breath, setting the stage for another dramatic chapter just 2 decades later. Chapter 3. Fast forward to 1967, and tensions in the region were once again at a fever pitch. In a matter of 6 days, the Six-Day War, as it would come to be known, would reshape the political landscape of the Middle East and further entrench the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Israel, facing threats from Egypt, Syria and Jordan, launched a preemptive strike, quickly gaining the upper hand. By the time the dust settled, Israel had seized control of the West Bank, the Gaza Strip, the Golan Heights from Syria and the Sinai Peninsula from Egypt. It was a stunning victory for Israel, but one with far-reaching consequences. Overnight, Israel had tripled the territory under its control, including areas home to a large Palestinian population. The Six-Day War marked the beginning of Israel's occupation of the West Bank and Gaza, a military presence that continues to fuel tensions to this day. The war also led to the displacement of even more Palestinians, adding to the growing refugee crisis. It seemed that every conflict only deepened the wounds of the past, further complicating the search for a lasting peace. The international community once again found itself grappling with the fallout. The UN Security Council issued Resolution 242, calling for Israel's withdrawal from the occupied territories in exchange for peace and recognition from its Arab neighbors. It was a landmark resolution, forming the basis of the Land for Peace formula that would dominate peace negotiations for decades to come. But translating this seemingly simple formula into a concrete agreement proved to be anything but simple. The Six-Day War had dramatically shifted the dynamics of the conflict, leaving behind a legacy of occupation, displacement, and a seemingly intractable struggle for land and recognition. Chapter 4. For decades after the Six-Day War, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict remained a seemingly intractable Gordian knot of animosity and mistrust. But then, in the early 1990s, a glimmer of hope emerged on the horizon: the Oslo Accords. Picture this: secret talks in Norway, clandestine meetings between Israeli and Palestinian officials, all leading to a historic handshake between Israeli Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin and PLO Chairman Yasser Arafat on the White House lawn in 1993. It was a watershed moment, a beacon of hope in a region often shrouded in darkness. The Oslo Accords were supposed to be the first step towards a two-state solution, a roadmap to peace after decades of conflict. They established the Palestinian Authority, granting Palestinians limited self-governance in parts of the West Bank and Gaza Strip. For a brief shining moment, it seemed like peace might actually be within reach, but like a house of cards built on a shaky foundation, the promise of Oslo began to crumble. The accords were vague on crucial details, like the final status of Jerusalem, the fate of Palestinian refugees, and the issue of Israeli settlements in the occupied territories. And those settlements, they kept growing like unwelcome weeds choking the land, further complicating the dream of a contiguous, viable Palestinian state. Meanwhile, extremist groups on both sides, opposed to any compromise, resorted to violence, further undermining trust and fueling the cycle of bloodshed. The assassination of Yitzhak Rabin by a Jewish extremist in 1995 dealt a devastating blow to the peace process, extinguishing the flickering flame of hope that Oslo had ignited. The Second Intifada, a Palestinian uprising marked by suicide bombings and Israeli military incursions, erupted in 2000, shattering any remaining illusions of a swift resolution. The Oslo Accords, once hailed as a breakthrough, now serve as a painful reminder of the fragility of peace in the face of deep-seated mistrust, extremist ideologies, and the failure to address the core issues at the heart of the conflict. Chapter 5. So here we are in the tangled web of the present, grappling with the legacy of decades of failed peace attempts, broken promises, and a seemingly endless cycle of violence. The Israeli-Palestinian conflict, far from fading into a distant memory, remains a stark reality for millions of people on the ground. The two-state solution, once seen as the most viable path to peace, feels like an increasingly distant prospect. The expansion of Israeli settlements in the West Bank continues, often described as facts on the ground that make a future Palestinian state geographically and politically challenging to achieve. Gaza, meanwhile, remains mired in poverty and despair, controlled by Hamas, a group designated as a terrorist organization by many countries. The Israeli blockade, coupled with recurring rounds of violence, has created a humanitarian crisis, trapping millions in a cycle of suffering and deprivation. The situation in Jerusalem, a city holy to both Jews and Muslims, remains a major flashpoint. The status of holy sites like the Temple Mount Haram al-Sharif, revered by both faiths, is a constant source of tension capable of igniting wider unrest at a moment's notice. Within both Israeli and Palestinian societies, there are growing voices of frustration, disillusionment, and a sense of hopelessness. Many, especially among the younger generations, feel the weight of history on their shoulders, inheriting a conflict they didn't create but are forced to endure. So what does the future hold? It's a question with no easy answers, but one thing is certain: finding a way to break the cycle of violence, address the root causes of the conflict, and create a future where both Israelis and Palestinians can live in peace and security remains one of the most pressing challenges of our time. So there you have it, a glimpse into the complex and often heartbreaking reality of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. It's a story of dispossession, occupation, and the human cost of a seemingly intractable political struggle. Understanding the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is crucial for grasping the complexities of modern geopolitics. It's a conflict that has shaped the Middle East, fueled regional instability, and sparked debate and division across the globe. Stay informed, and let's hope for a peaceful resolution in the future. But beyond the headlines and the geopolitical chess game, it's essential to remember that this conflict is, at its core, about people. People who deserve dignity, security, and the chance to live in peace, free from fear and violence.